Hey everybody, Zach again, newtutorial.com, coming in making a video for you today. I'm getting lots of questions based on the feast days this year and why I'm keeping them at dates that others are not. This year, my Sukkot is going to be in October, and many people are keeping their Sukkot, their Feast of Tabernacles, in September. And a lot of people are asking why the discrepancy, why the difference. And I just want to explain that today in this video, but I want to begin by letting you all know that, listen, if you're keeping it at a certain time, I've said this throughout my videos throughout the years, that it's okay. I'm not one of these people who are like, you have to keep it on this day, and if you don't keep it on this day, you're going to hell. There are people out there like that. I'm not one of them. I don't care. I think that our Father looks down at his people and he sees that we're trying to keep the feast. We're trying to throw off these pagan feasts that are rooted in pagan idolatry and fertility rites, and that because all of Christmas, Easter, they all have their basic roots in fertility. December, is the time when the sun is the lowest in the sky at the end of December. Okay, you look at the sun; it's at the lowest point of its position in the sky. And the pagan peoples throughout history have worshiped for that sun to return and come back and rise again. And by the time of the spring equinox, it has risen more in the sky to where life returns. And so it's called that was when so many of the fertility rites were used in worship of the sun god and other god, the moon god, and all these different gods, these idols of wood and stone. And there's no doubt that these things are rooted in pagan idolatry. And so the Father says, if you're going to worship me, you're going to worship me in my way. He says, these are my feasts because all the other gods have their feasts, and they're all rooted in that sort of fertility pagan rites. And so when the Father looks down, he sees his people trying to be obedient, even if they're not doing it perfectly. He's just like, oh, it's like little kids trying to be obedient to their parents. A little child with an obedient heart who tries to please his father or mother. And so I think the Father looks down upon us so far removed from the old ways that were known by the patriarchs, us trying to do what the other Israelites never had a heart for, and he's grateful. Oh, these are my kids. Look at them. Look at little Johnny. Like any parent would do. And so even though we're not on the same path, and we will be one day, we will get there, I think that it's okay. And so there are people here this year who are keeping it in September, and there are people like me who are keeping it in October. And I think the majority of people are keeping it in September because of the Jewish calendar, the Hillel 2 calendar, and they're following along with that and some different variations of that. So why am I keeping it in October? Just to let you guys know, I'm not putting anyone down who's keeping it in September. In fact, I'm speaking at 2 Sukkot events this year in September. I'm going and speaking at those because it's okay for me. I don't mind that someone else is keeping a different date. It's not a big deal for me. I'm totally okay with that. But why am I keeping it in October? It's for a simple fact of I look at the agriculture. Okay, the real reason the Hillel 2 calendar got started was because of dispersion. And right now, Israel is now a nation again. And I truly believe that our true brother Judah, part of true Judah is living in Israel. Not all. I mean, there's definitely some pagan stuff going on in Israel, some crazy bad stuff going on in Israel. I get it. They have the second world's largest gay pride in Tel Aviv every year. Okay? So not all of Judah is Judah. But, the whole Revelation 2:9 and 3:9 verses come into play there at that point. And that's the true definition of those two verses, Revelation 2:9 and 3:9. However, real Judah is in the land. No doubt about it in my mind. Okay? And they're back. So I think we need to look at agriculture and to now start a calendar. I hope at some point this gets revisited. And it really comes down to a point of God's people wanting to do God's things in God's ways. With that, okay, this last spring, someone spotted, a ripe Abib grain in the land, and they were like, oh, we got to count the next moon. And they don't ever take into account that just because one part of Israel gets a slight majority in its grain field to be ripe, doesn't mean all of Israel. Because see, a farmer doesn't harvest his field until it's all ripe. Just because you find a few ripe grains or half of it ripe, doesn't mean it's all ripe and that you can just, do your harvest. It doesn't work that way. And not only that, think about this. These feasts are for the entire nation. So let's just say southern Israel gets its grain ripe. Is northern Israel ripe? Well, then you can't start your count yet. Because they all have to do, just because you don't get to go to it, the southern Israel doesn't get to go to a separate feast where that northern Israel doesn't get to go to. So if you look at things in terms of an agricultural perspective, you have to all go at once. And see, that takes time. And so I think we were early this year by a lot, and it proves itself by this fall because some of the people who are majority of them keeping Sukkot in September have had their Day of Trumpets, and when it's still technically summertime. And not only that, we have this verse in Deuteronomy 16, verse 13. Let's read it. You shall observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days after you have gathered in your corn and your wine. The Feast of Tabernacles 7 days after you have gathered in your corn and your wine. Now, I know that, wine is harvested, grapes are harvested, wine is made, I should say, in Israel after, or during the month of September. At this point, they're still harvesting grapes. There's still grapes you have to harvest in September, early to mid-September. You're telling me that at a time when there was no grain harvesters, where there was no machines, no tractors, everything was done by hand, you're telling me that all this could be done and in place and fermented by hand with no machines and no modern technology and still make it to the feast in September. You're out of your ever-loving mind. There is no way. There is no way. Absolutely no way. Which means we're early. We're too early. So again, I'm not putting anyone down. I'm not saying, that you guys are all going to hell because you're keeping it in September. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that I'm looking at it from an agricultural perspective, and this is why I push agriculture so heavily on this channel so often, is because the Hebrew people were an agricultural people. That's what they were. Everything about, you look at the scriptures and everything about it is about, what they grew, what they harvested, their livestock, the plants they grew, the fields, the corn, the grain, everything they grew. They were an agricultural-based people. And so with that mindset, and homesteading has really helped me get my head wrapped around that in so many ways. I've learned so much. There are so many people, even in the Torah movement, who have ridiculed me for moving off to a homestead, supposedly living out there in the middle of nowhere on some mountain. I do live on a small mountain. I mean, people in Colorado wouldn't call it a mountain, but it's a mountain. It's a mountain technically. But, I mean, it's like 2,200 feet in the air. But still, having lived this way and lived out here, it has really made Scripture come alive in so many ways. And people have ridiculed me for that. But in the reality, it's just made me closer to understanding God's Word. Guys, okay, there's no way you're going to get all your wine and grapes harvested mid-September and have it fermented, because you're not leaving for a feast. You're not leaving to go party until the work is done. Work before play, that old phrase. There's no way you're going to be able to get all that done by hand when you had all the things that need to be done for harvest. That's why it's a harvest festival. You're celebrating all of the work you've just completed. You're celebrating all of the blessings that God has bestowed upon your work, the sowing of the seed and the harvest of everything that you've sown. That's the party. And then you're bringing your first fruits to the party. There's no way you're going to bring your first wine. You can actually make wine very quickly. Your first fruits wine. If you harvest it in September and you ferment, it only takes, a certain amount of days to get your first wine. Now, it's not going to be an aged wine. It's not going to be an oaked wine like we have wine today. But you can get a first wine fermented and brought to the feast if you're harvesting your grapes in September and going to a feast sometime in October. You can do that, okay? It's completely possible. You can bring your first corn, whatever grain it's being used. It says corn in the King James, but it's really just grain. You can bring whatever first grain you have, you're harvesting, guys, I still have stuff in my garden growing in September. My harvest isn't done. But October, most everything's finished, okay? In fact, there's people out there who have suggested and brought forth studies that the first American Thanksgiving was actually a Sukkot. okay, by the pilgrims, and they were actually celebrating that biblical feast. And we have it today in November, but people, if they study it, they believe that actually took place in October. Was it a type of Sukkot, Feast of Tabernacles, by the pilgrims? I don't know, but people have suggested it might have been. Either way, it doesn't matter. You party after the work is done, and there's no way in September the work is done yet. Even in Israel today, they're still harvesting grapes early to mid-September. And to get all that fermented and processed, that because when the grapes are picked, you have a time limit. The time starts ticking. You don't have time. You got to get those grapes squished and the juices fermented. Otherwise, they will spoil if you don't. You have to. That's your options. Or you have to put them in and make them into raisins or dried fruits or whatever. But you have time. You don't have time. You have to get that started. And to squeeze in a feast there, it's not going to happen. So again, I'm looking at agriculture. And because I'm looking at agriculture, I know that I just don't believe, at least, that September could be a right date. And I don't believe that once in the spring you find just a little bit of ripe grain in one part of Israel, that sets the feast for the entire country, because the rest of the country isn't finished yet. Okay, we need to think agriculturally. And when a country right now, guys, do you think Israel today looks anything like it did 2,000 years ago? I mean, this was supposed to be a land flowing with milk and honey, especially beyond 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. I mean, at the time of Jacob and Esau, right? They go in to get the blessing. Esau is out hunting deer. There's no deer in Israel today. It's not the same country. It's different. It was a land flowing with milk and honey. There was agriculture all over it. The Canaanites, they were doing all kinds of stuff. They were growing everything and raising everything. There's no deer in Israel today. I think I looked it up. How many deer are in Israel today? I think Google said 200 deer. And that's only because the government secretly took deer from Iran and transplanted them into Israel to release them again. It was a release program. Guys, I got like 200 deer just in my neighborhood. I see more deer than I see people on most days. There's deer everywhere out where I live. And in Israel, there's only 200 deer? Do you think if there's only 200 deer in a nation, Esau is going to be able to go out and get venison like that? It didn't say how long he was gone, but it says he went out to get a deer, get venison, and he came back with venison. It was a different nation back then. And it's a different nation today. I think we need to start looking at this agriculturally. And I think at some point, the Jews, Judah in the land, is going to have to redo this Hallel 2 calendar, because the whole purpose Hallel 2 was created in the first place was because of dispersion. And I think we need to do things, our calendar, God's calendar, according to the land that Judah is now living again in. I hope that makes sense. I don't, so I'm not into I'm not doing the September, I'm doing October. And again, I'm not putting anyone down who's keeping September, but I'm hoping to give you a better idea of why I'm doing October instead of September. It just makes more sense to me agriculturally. There's no way it's agriculturally possible to pull off what you're pulling off because we can do it all today, because we're all shipping containers and imports and exports and all of this stuff. I mean, we talk about lambs and sheep and goats and stuff like that for Passover, but they import most of their lamb from New Zealand. They don't even grow a lot of sheep, or hardly any, in Israel. You can't even get one. Why? There's no grazing land. It looks different today than it did back then. You could not do today. You can't do today what they did back then. One day that'll all change. Messiah is coming, and he is going to make this a land, again, flowing with milk and honey. I guarantee it. But right now, it's different. But I'm looking at the calendar, the way the Bible states it, and how the Hebrew people have always been an agricultural people. And I'm thinking to myself, this doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. And so we're keeping it a month apart. At some point, we're all going to be on the same page. There's a bazillion different calendars out there. You got the Zadok calendar, Enoch calendars, on all variations of those. And you got sliver and conjunction calendars, and you got the Hallel 2, and there's variations even of that. So it's just, everyone's on different pages. At some point, we're going to be on the same page. And I think the way we get on that page is we get on our knees and we ask the Father to send our Messiah to bring us all under his control, to establish his kingdom on earth, because right now sin is out of control, and the only way sin is going to get under control is if the Messiah comes and fixes all this, because right now it's a giant mess. All right, we'll leave it at that. Go home, read your Bible. Thanks.